Okay, so over the course of the days, we've heard people have some complaints about Path of Exile 2, about how there's not enough loot dropping, or it's too difficult, or it's just not a good new player experience in general. And people have a lot of different ideas about what the problem is or what it isn't. But I think there's really a big underlying problem that people aren't really talking about. Not that I've seen at the very least. And that issue I see is agency. So, what I mean about agency, right? I'm talking about agency over your player power, which obviously, if you want to talk about player power, it really comes down to three things mostly, right? You have your gear, which is where probably most of it comes from. You have your passive tree, which is where, well, in the end game is probably where maybe even most of it comes from. But yeah. And then you have your choice of skills. And these three kind of come together to make your character. And now in the very early game, you have very limited access to passive points, and very limited access to gear, and very limited access to skills. This kind of comes together to give you not much agency. We can kind of look at each one individually here. So we talk about gear. There's not really much dropping in the early game, which is to be expected, to be clear. Not many rares, not much stuff at all. We do get a lot of stuff to craft magic items, which is decently nice. So you're pretty able for the most part to get good magic items. But rares are pretty, well, rare, right? And above all else, it's just completely random, right? You have no control over what your gear looks like. And that's what I mean by agency. You have no control over this. Now, in Path of Exile 1, obviously, we had a crafting bench, so we can put a mod of our choice onto items to kind of fix what small issues we may or may not have, right? In this game, that's not the case. Instead, GGG has said that the rune system here is what they've put in the game to try and kind of alleviate the same kind of issue with patching small issues you might have with your gear. But the problem with this is that early, there's just really none of it. It's not like the runes and the rune slots, they're just not front-loaded enough, right? You don't have access to them early game when you especially need them, right? And so you just really have a big lack of agency over your gear. And no control feels bad, unsurprisingly, right? And that's kind of maybe the biggest point, but then if we go to the passive tree, right? Surely, when it comes to the passive tree, we have a ton of agency, right? We can just pick whatever points we want. And while that is true, it's not really that simple, right? Because, well, I'm a warrior, it might be worse for warrior than it is for other classes when it comes to this, but if we take a look at the early game passive tree here, what do we really have for options, right? We can path through the attributes. Are really going to do that? Not really, right? We do have access to flat armor, actually, which is pretty huge at the very beginning. I've unspec'd that. 30 armor, not a big deal at this point in the game. Regen is just not really useful early game when you don't have a big life pool, and when the life pool disappears in the span of like 1 second, right? If you're getting a bad spot, life regen is just not gonna do you any good at all. So this is more of a late game thing. If you can kind of reach a critical mass of recovery, stun threshold, I mean, that has its uses actually early on, I'd say, but it's just not really worth going here, right? You have stun build up. Also, it's the same kind of deal, but there's really only one real choice in my opinion, and it's you have melee damage. And obviously, when I hover over these skills, they are not as good as they look here. They are plus 50% because of the hulking form passive on the Titan right now. So these are not as good as they look right now. So you just don't really have much of choice early game in terms of the passive tree. And what choice you do have doesn't provide you that much power either. Obviously, the more you go in, the more it opens up. There's look at this fucking thing. There's a ton of stuff you can get. But yeah, as I said, this too is just not front-loaded enough. You don't have enough choice over your character early on in the game. And what is that? Low agency over your character power, right? And then we can talk about skills. I don't have a skill gem to show you, but I assume this. I mean, this is the same for pretty much every class, or exactly every class. I think there's just not very many choices for skills early on. I know for warrior, there's like what 3 or 4 different skills you can take in the beginning, and a lot of them feel bad. There's just a lot of bad choices for us. Now, this also opens up over the course of the game because the skills are locked behind higher level gems. So again, this is just not front-loaded enough, right? Because what are we going to do? Take skills from other classes when all we really have access to is a ton of strength everywhere, and our class inherently has a lot of strength. So at that point, we're forced to go and take, well, attributes to try and, well, get access to these skills from other classes. But that means we have no percent damage or anything else anywhere. It's just not very easy to do. And what is that? Low agency, right? So that's really a recurring problem, I think, that we have, especially in the early game of this game. Yeah, all this just kind of comes together and means that in the early game, if you feel stuck at any given point in time, you're really just out of luck, unless you want to grind some of the early zones that you've already played through, which just doesn't feel good for new players. That if you do that, that's because it feels like that's because your character's just weak and you're behind, right? That's something you really want to avoid. But yeah, GGG has come out earlier today, I think, just very recently at least, and actually gone very far to try and fix some of these problems in some good ways, maybe some less good ways. I haven't really taken a deep look at it right now. But one thing's clear, GGG is looking at what's happening, they're looking at the problems, they're trying to fix it. And overall, I've had a pretty good experience with the game. And one thing, all this kind of culminates, right? When you have low agency, low choice in the early game, it's very predictable. There's way less variance in terms of where your character's going to be at, your character power, right? And that means that they can balance the boss fights early on more towards it. And that has absolutely, at least for me, made the early boss fights in this game have been very exhilarating. They've been very good fights. And as I've had more agency to make my character stronger in the way that I prefer, the boss fights have become kind of a complete non-issue. They've become kind of a joke. So there are obviously positives and detriments to it all. And it's not really that simple of a thing to fix, but yeah, what we do is just we trust in GGG, and hopefully they make some good choices. They have in the past, surely they will in the future. After all, this is still early access, so I mean, what can we really do other than see what they decide is good? And I did take a quick look over the changes that they've done, and it looked like they have been addressing a lot of issues. So there's definitely a ton of hope for the future, and the game's really fun. It's very good. It's only going to become better. So I think that was it for me. I don't think I have particularly anything else to say. That's really just all I needed to get off my chest. And I'll see you all in Ray class or wherever else.